She was screaming at me through the phone at 11 o'clock at night, and I was standing on a balcony in Savannah, Georgia, watching the river lights flicker on the water. Finally, breathing like a man who had remembered how. That's the part nobody tells you about leaving. They talk about the pain. They don't talk about the quiet on the other side of it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to where it actually started, because nothing happens in a vacuum, and the worst betrayals don't arrive like a storm. They come in slowly, like water finding cracks in a foundation. You don't notice until the floor caves in. My name is Vincent, and I am 63 years old. I spent 31 years working as a civil engineer for a county infrastructure firm outside of Atlanta. I was not a flashy man. I drove a sensible car, wore sensible shoes, packed my lunch most days. My daughter used to tease me about that. Said I was the only man she knew who ironed his grocery list. I took that as a compliment. I met my wife. I'll call her my ex-wife now, because that's what she is. When I was 31 years old at a church picnic in Decatur. Her name was Adrian. She was beautiful in the way that makes a man stop thinking straight, and she knew it, and I didn't care that she knew it. We dated for 2 years. We got married in October of 1994. For about the first decade, I would have told you it was the best decision I ever made. But marriages change. People change. And sometimes a person reveals themselves so slowly that you don't recognize what you're looking at until it's far too late. Adrian was a real estate agent. Good at it too. She had a gift for making people feel like a house was already theirs the moment they walked through the door. She made decent money. Not great, but decent. And for a long time, we were a good team. I handled the infrastructure. She handled the aesthetics. The house we bought in 2001 was in her name and mine. 11 years later, she convinced me to refinance, and in the paperwork shuffle, my name came off the primary title. She said it was for tax purposes. I didn't ask enough questions. I should have. Lord, I should have. The distance between us didn't announce itself. It just showed up one day like furniture that had been rearranged while I was sleeping. I'd come home and she'd be on the phone, and she'd take the phone to the other room. I'd try to make plans for the weekend, and she'd already have something with her colleagues. I started noticing that she talked about one colleague in particular. I'll call him her co-worker, more than anyone else. He was in commercial real estate, younger than me by about 12 years. Drove a Range Rover. She mentioned the Range Rover twice. I want to be honest here. I didn't suspect an affair right away. I suspected something was wrong with us. I asked her, more than once, if she wanted to go to counseling. She said we didn't need counseling. She said I was being dramatic. She said I needed to trust her more. That last part, looking back, is almost funny. What finally made the ground shift under my feet wasn't what you'd expect. It wasn't a text message or a lipstick collar. It was my son-in-law. My daughter married a quiet man, a good man, who worked in commercial insurance and had the kind of steady presence that made you feel like things were going to be okay. He called me one evening in late February. My daughter was at a baby shower, he said, and he asked if I had a few minutes. I said sure. He told me he didn't want to get involved in our business, but that he'd seen something at a work networking event 2 weekends before. He'd seen Adrian and her co-worker arrive together, leave together, and in between, behave in a way that wasn't ambiguous. He said, "I'm sorry, sir. I thought you should know." I thanked him. I sat at my kitchen table for 3 hours after that call and didn't move, didn't eat, didn't turn on the television. Just sat there with the weight of it settling into my chest like wet concrete. I didn't confront her that night. I'd spent 30 years in engineering, and the one thing engineering teaches you is that you don't touch the structure until you understand what's holding it up and what's about to bring it down. So I waited. I watched. I started paying attention to our finances with the same care I used to reserve for structural load calculations. What I found took me about 6 weeks to piece together, and when I had the whole picture, I had to sit down again. She had opened a joint business account with her co-worker 14 months earlier. Not a personal account, a business account for what appeared to be a property management LLC. I found the paperwork folded inside a jacket pocket she hadn't worn in a while. I wasn't snooping. I was looking for a pen. The LLC had been funded, at least partially, from a home equity line of credit she had taken against our house. Our house. The house that was now primarily in her name. She had borrowed $87,000 against our equity, without telling me, without my signature, because my name wasn't on the primary title anymore. $87,000. I am not a man who cries easily. I cried that night. Not because of the money, though the money was real. I cried because I understood for the first time that I had been managed, carefully, deliberately managed. The refinancing, the title. The years of me being kept slightly outside the loop of our own financial life. None of it was careless. It was architecture. I called a lawyer the next morning. I want to be clear about what my lawyer told me, because I know some people in my situation go in hot and make mistakes. She told me to document everything quietly, to not make major financial moves without guidance, and to understand that Georgia is an equitable distribution state, meaning the court decides what's fair, not a simple 50-50 split. She told me that what Adrian had done with the equity line was legally complicated, and that I had real ground to stand on. I listened to every word. I asked Adrian for a divorce in April. I did it on a Sunday morning over coffee at the kitchen table. I had all my documentation in a folder beside me on the chair. I slid it across the table before she could say anything and told her I knew about the LLC, the equity line, and her co-worker. I told her I was not interested in a fight, but I was not going to be managed anymore. She looked at the folder. She looked at me. Then she looked out the window for a long time. She said, "I didn't think you'd ever find out." Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "It's not what you think." Just that. I didn't think you'd ever find out. After 30 years, that was the sentence. The divorce took 11 months. It was not pleasant. She was not the woman who wanted to sit down and settle things quietly anymore. She contested the equity line issue, claiming the funds had been used for shared household expenses. Her lawyer was aggressive. Mine was better. The judge was unimpressed with her accounting. In the end, I received a settlement that included a share of the home proceeds, a portion of her retirement accounts, and a lump sum that partially offset what had been taken without my knowledge. It wasn't everything. It never is. But it was fair, and I could live with fair. My daughter handled it with grace. She was heartbroken about the family, the way children of divorce always are, even when they're grown. She never blamed me. She never blamed her mother out loud either, though I know my son-in-law had told her what he saw. She called me every Sunday for the entire 11 months of the divorce proceedings. Every single Sunday. I don't have words for what that meant to me. My son was a different story. He was 27 at the time. He lived in Charlotte, worked in tech sales, and had his mother's gift for making people feel like they were in good hands. He was also, and I say this with love, because he is my child, fiercely loyal to his mother in a way that could sometimes mistake loyalty for truth. He called me about 6 weeks into the divorce, and he told me, and I am going to quote this, as close to exactly as I can remember, because it matters. "Dad, I've heard both sides now. Mom has her faults, sure. But you were never present. You were always working. You never gave her what she needed. He does. He's been successful in a way that made her feel valued. I'm not saying what she did was right, but I understand it." He was not finished. "He's building something real. I'm going to stand up with him at the wedding. My son was going to be the best man at the wedding of the man who had helped dismantle my marriage and benefited from $87,000 of my equity." I did not yell. I am not a yeller. I said, "I hear you. I hope you find a way to be at peace with that." And I hung up, and I did not call him back for 2 months. Not out of anger, I want to be precise here, but because I genuinely did not know what to say, and I refused to say the wrong thing. The divorce finalized in March of the following year. By that point, I had already begun making plans that had nothing to do with staying in Atlanta. I had a college friend, we had been roommates at Georgia Tech for 3 years, who had retired early and moved to Savannah about 4 years prior. He had been telling me for 2 years to come visit, that the city would do something to me that Atlanta could not. I had always put it off. Now I had no reason to put anything off. I drove down in April, 4 weeks after the divorce was final. I was going to stay for a weekend. I stayed for 8 days. Savannah is not what people expect, especially if you've spent your whole life in a major metropolitan area. It doesn't rush. The streets are laid out in these old squares with live oak trees hanging overhead, Spanish moss, moving in whatever breeze comes off the river. I walked those squares every morning while my friend made coffee. And I thought, slowly, about what I actually wanted the rest of my life to look like. I was 62 years old. I had my settlement. I had my pension. I had a daughter who called me every Sunday. I had, technically, complete freedom for the first time in 31 years. The question was what to do with it. I went back to Atlanta. I gave notice at work. I had been eligible for retirement for 2 years already, but had kept working because stopping felt like giving up on something, though I could never name what. I put my belongings into a storage unit. I signed a 6-month lease on a small apartment in Savannah's historic district, and I told myself I was just trying it. No permanent decisions, just trying. That was 15 months ago. I have not gone back. There is a rhythm to life in Savannah that I had forgotten was possible. I take long walks in the morning. I have a standing Tuesday lunch with my friend and 2 men he introduced me to. One, a retired federal judge, one a former high school principal, and we sit at the same table at the same cafe and argue about everything from football to monetary policy. I started volunteering with a program that mentors young men aging out of the foster care system. I help them understand basic financial literacy, how to open a checking account, how to read a lease, how to ask questions about things they don't understand before they sign anything. That last one I understand better than most. I cooked more in those first 6 months than I had in the previous decade. I learned that I liked jazz more than I'd realized. I sat on my small balcony in the evenings and watched the light change over the river and felt something I had almost forgotten the name of. I felt like myself. I want to be careful not to make this sound like a fairy tale, because it was not. I had nights where I lay awake going over every decision I'd made for 30 years and wondering what would have been different if I'd asked more questions earlier, if I'd paid closer attention, if I'd trusted my own instincts instead of trusting that the person across the dinner table from me every night was operating in good faith. Those nights were long. I got through them, but I want to name them, because anyone who's been through something like this knows that the piece doesn't arrive fully assembled. You build it. Day by day, choice by choice, you build it. My son came around, not all at once, and not with an apology that hit every note I might have wanted. But he called me in October, 7 months after the divorce, and asked if I wanted to come watch a Panthers game with him in Charlotte. I said yes. We sat in his apartment, ate wings, and mostly watched football. Near the end of the 4th quarter, during a commercial, he said quietly, without looking at me, "I should have called you more during all of it." I said, "Yeah, you should have." He nodded. We went back to the game. That was enough. It had to be enough, and it was. My daughter and her husband brought my granddaughter down to Savannah in January. She's 3 years old. She spent an entire morning chasing pigeons in one of the squares near my apartment and could not understand why the pigeons kept leaving. My daughter took a photo of me sitting on a bench watching my granddaughter run, and she sent it to me later that night with a text that said, "You look happy, Daddy. Real happy." I stared at that message for a long time. She was right. Now, I need to tell you about the phone call, because you've been patient, and this is the part that prompted me to sit down and record this in the first place. The wedding happened in September. I know this because my son attended. He did not volunteer details, and I did not ask for many. What I know is that it was held at an event venue outside of Buckhead, that there were roughly 120 guests, and that at some point during the reception, one of the guests, an older woman who had known Adrian for many years and apparently did not know that the groom's backstory was quite what it was, made a toast. From what my son told me later, the woman meant well. She raised her glass and said something along the lines of, "To Adrian, who finally has a man who puts her first, after everything she's been through." And then she said, "And to think, a year ago, most of us didn't even know your first marriage had ended." That was it. That was the line, because the room went very quiet, and several people exchanged looks, and it became clear in that moment that a significant portion of the guests, colleagues of his, professional contacts, people who mattered to the picture he had been constructing, had been told something that was not entirely accurate about how Adrian had come to be available, or perhaps had simply not been told anything at all, and had assumed. And the assumption was now publicly, gently, crumbling. "My son," said Adrian, held her composure through the rest of the evening. "She is a composed woman. She always was." But he said that she was not the same after that toast, and that at one point he saw her standing near the bar with a fixed expression on her face that he recognized. He said he'd only seen it once before, when her mother died, as the face she made when she was working very hard not to fall apart in public. 3 weeks after the wedding, she called me. It was a Tuesday night, around 11 o'clock. I was on my balcony. I looked at my phone and I recognized the number, and I stood there for 2 full rings deciding whether to answer. I answered. She was not calm. She was crying and not hiding it, which surprised me more than the call itself, because Adrian did not like to be seen struggling. She said she needed to explain some things. She said the situation wasn't what I had thought it was. She said she had made mistakes, and that things with her co-worker, her husband, were not, at this stage, what she had imagined they would be. I let her talk. I did not interrupt. I did not offer reassurance. I did not say anything unkind. When she paused, I said, "Adrienne, I hope you find your way through this. I genuinely do. But I'm not the person you call anymore." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You sound different." I said, "I know." And I ended the call, and I stood there on my balcony, and I watched the river lights, and I felt not vindicated, that's the wrong word, I felt settled. Like something that had been slightly askew for a long time had finally, quietly, clicked back into place. I want to say something directly to anyone listening who is in a situation that resembles mine. Not the specific facts. Every marriage is its own architecture. But the feeling of it, the feeling of having given a very significant portion of your life to something and discovering that the other person in that arrangement was operating under a different set of rules than you were. Here is what I learned, and I mean this without bitterness, because bitterness is a weight, and I have put down enough weight in the last 2 years. Pay attention to the finances, not because money is everything, but because how a person treats shared resources tells you something real about how they see the partnership. Read the documents. Ask the questions that feel impolite to ask. Know what your name is on and what it is not on and why. I am not telling you to be suspicious of everyone you love. I am telling you that love without clarity is just trust without information. And trust without information can be used against you by someone who understands exactly what they're doing. Know when to leave, I stayed longer than I should have because I was afraid of what leaving meant. I thought leaving meant failure. It does not. Sometimes leaving is the most precise decision you can make, like identifying the part of a structure that is beyond repair and choosing to build something new rather than pour resources into something that cannot hold. And let people in. My son-in-law made a difficult phone call that he didn't have to make. My friend opened his home to me and his city to me and did not ask for anything in return. My daughter called every Sunday. Nobody gets through something like this alone, and if you're trying to, you are making it harder than it has to be. Savannah suits me. My apartment has high ceilings and old wooden floors and a kitchen window that looks out onto a courtyard where someone has planted gardenias. I did not know what gardenias smelled like until I moved here. Now I know. There's a man who plays saxophone near the river on Friday evenings. Sometimes I walk over and listen. Sometimes I sit on a bench and read. Sometimes I do nothing at all, and that, I have discovered, is not a waste of time. That is the work. My granddaughter is coming back in April. She has informed her mother, very seriously, that she and I are going to feed the pigeons this time, and she is going to catch one. I have not told her that catching a pigeon is probably not going to happen. Some things you let a person discover on their own terms. I built bridges for 31 years, structural ones, the kind that carry weight across gaps, that have to hold under pressure, that have to account for the forces you can predict and the ones you can't. I know what a solid foundation looks like. I know what a compromised one looks like too. What I have now is solid. It took longer than it should have to get here. But here is where I am, and here is where I am staying. And if you're standing somewhere right now that no longer feels solid, I just want you to know that solid exists. You might have to travel farther than you expected to find it. But it's there. I promise you, it's there.